edition of the On the Mic podcast. And after a brief hiatus, we are back in a big way. So much to talk to my next guest about. Super excited. I promise not to fanboy out. The one and only, a MMA veteran, legend, commentator, BattleBots, PFL, the host and co-host of the Anik Florian Podcast, the one and only Kenny Florian. Sir, how are you?
I'm well, Mike. Thank you.
You're the only missing piece I haven't had on this show. I've had Jon
really?
on the show a couple times. I've had Cody on the show a few times.
Oh, cool.
So I was like, when I got this opportunity, it made complete sense to have you on.
Right on.
And the first hard-hitting question I have for you is, who is the harder of the two co-hosts you have to work with? Is it Sean O'Connell or Jon Anik?
Yeah, that's a good question. Gosh, they're both a bunch of jerks. It's trying to measure that jerk factor. That's the most difficult part. No, man, I'm really lucky that, in this business, I really don't run into too many jerks, on the TV side of things, actually, especially guys that are, that I've known a while that are from the fight business. I really don't really have that. I don't have that on the BattleBot side either. I've just been super lucky, man, to work with good people, and I like them both, man. They're both great guys. Obviously, I've known Jon Anik in a very long time, since like 2007. So he's my boy.
So I tried to do the brownie points because I did it when the last time Jon and I did a video interview. I wore the Ray Donovan hat, and he called it out. So knowing you both are born and bred in Massachusetts, I went with all the Boston gear today. No, they're both great. I've had all of them, both Sean and Jon on here. And honestly, I don't have to tell you, I think it's so important, especially on the TV side of things, as a media, someone who went to school for media. I get it. Being in the TV side, it is so more important to have like the right team around you. And podcasting on the audio side, it's easy to come and go, but especially on TV, like you're there in front of millions, and you have been there. And I think that's one thing I love so much about just you and your career path inside the cage, outside the cage. What has been, I would say, the easiest transition or the easiest way for you as a commentator on fight nights? Because we understand a former fighter calling a fight. Like, there's a different perspective. But you've been calling fights, and you're an analyst on the other side doing this podcast. And, when you're on your UFC Tonight, doing from the desk and to the podcast and then to the commentary booth, and having been inside the cage, you get to take it from so many different aspects. What was the easiest transition from you to go from fighter to broadcasting?
What was the easiest aspect? I guess just the, just the analytical side. I kind of always had that approach, or tried to have that approach towards my opponents and towards what I thought I needed to do. So I do my best to try to look at it as honestly as I can. I've become more honest and more forthright as time has moved on, as I've gotten older, for a couple reasons. I think when I was fighting, if I'm being honest, I would hold back a lot of information in some ways, just because I always felt like the enemy was watching, and of course I was, doing analytical work for ESPN and doing commentating at times while I was fighting. So I think part of it, the other part of it, if I'm being honest too, is obviously I know a lot more than I did back then as well. I like to think so anyway. So I try to be as honest as possible. I've had an easier time, not an easy time, but an easier time giving picks on fights, which is still something I never liked in the beginning. But yeah, so just as far as, information, I think that's the easiest thing. It's like breaking things down as I see it. It's something I've done. It came, I guess, kind of natural to me. So I just kind of pretend like I'm teaching or showing something that someone's not aware of, and I try to approach it that way, and still doing my best. I still always feel like I have more to improve on and more to work on.
Well, the great thing for me is not only did you just record your latest episode of the Anik Florian Podcast yesterday, that's up on DraftKings YouTube. Everyone go check it out and subscribe. But also, we've had so many news pieces hit since the time you guys have put that episode up that I'll get to ask you about. I'm going to try not to ask you for predictions for this weekend's UFC card because I can sense, I think you might know a couple of guys involved in the main and co-main. Yeah. But one thing that's big for me, and obviously I had a chance to work with him at SiriusXM. I'm no longer there. I'm not Luke Thomas. I think Luke Thomas is a rare breed. But when it comes to breaking down fights in that aspect. The reason I got into the sport, because I come from NFL, NBA, sports broadcasting, but the reason I got into the sport 8 years ago is because I felt storytelling was my calling, and that's why I do this podcast. As someone who has been inside the cage and now calls fights from outside the cage, how important is it to you, having been there? Do you feel like it is necessary for the broadcast or anyone covering the sport to allow the correct story of the fighters to be told? Because we know LeBron James and Steph Curry, they're going to play in a 7-game series, and we know who they are and all of this. But very few times do we know the Jon Joneses, the Conor McGregors, the Aljamain Sterlings, the Henry Cejudos. And I think even when we talk about such a high-level profile title fight this weekend at UFC 288, not everyone knows their stories. And I think that's part of what makes the fighter. So how important is storytelling in this sport?
I think it is. I think it's very important. I think it's another question. You said correct storytelling. I think that it gets tricky as you start to say that, right? Because some fighters or some people may say, well, is that really correct? Is that accurate? Is that as deep about myself? Obviously there's levels to that. And that can be open to interpretation, but I would say that, yeah, it's extremely important, especially now that the UFC has so many fighters. It's harder, I think, for, let's say, an organization like the UFC to tell all of those stories and to tell them as thoroughly as they would like. And I think that's a part for why the UFC, it's harder for them to gain. Well, I'll say this, is that it's harder for them to get a following on some of the smaller fight nights. I think the pay-per-views will always be big because they're naturally using bigger names in the main and co-main events. But in like things like the fight night, I don't know if the stories are being told as much. And if they're being told as much throughout the year. I felt like when I was fighting, I had the benefit of not being a part of this huge roster where a lot of people got a chance to see my story, hear my story. The Ultimate Fighter, of course, was critical for that. I thought the media, did a really good job of, telling those stories, getting your story out there. Now, I think when you're talking about almost 700 fighters or whatever it is, there's a lot of guys that you got to tell a story about. And, it becomes even more difficult for the fighter itself, right? Because the media in a lot of ways can do your job for you, both as an organization and as a fighter, as a businessman. So, yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that.
Yeah, so that's always been my biggest thing because, like I said, I grew up, here in Chicago. It's Bears, it's Bulls, Cubs, White Sox, all that.
Yeah.
And for me to there's not much. I don't have to tell you, there's not much MMA in the Midwest, especially in Chicago. You would think it could be a hotbed, but you look at a guy like Curtis Blades, had to leave. Pro Gonzalez had to leave. Ricardo Lamas is probably one of the very few who stayed here and made something, in Chicago. So for me, it's something where I was like, all right, so I'm not going to be able to break down these fights like a Luke Thomas, but I can have an opportunity to talk to, fighters, broadcasters like yourself, and just people in this business, and let them, like I feel, correctly tell their story. And that's why I got into this, and that's why I'm so happy. I didn't want to ask so early, but since we're on it, and because it, not only personally did I love it, but I also, it meant so much because it helped me get through a lot of rough times, even though it was off air when I watched it. When I look back at something you were a part of, and that being the show Kingdom, I know obviously Hollywood is one thing, and you obviously add the Hollywood effect to it, but a lot of that show was so real. When you pull back the curtain, it was so real. Do you think, and I'm not saying let's reboot Kingdom, although that would be great, but do you think shows like that could be needed now once again to kind of reintroduce, because that was right around the Conor McGregor rise.
Right.
But now that he's here and like that's bringing in a whole crowd of people, I think a show like Kingdom could really pull back the curtain and get people to understand what fighters go through on a day-to-day, rather than just being like, yeah, I know about this fighter and let's just go out to the bar and watch their fight.
No, totally. I think there is so much that people don't know about in regards to a fighter and the trials and tribulations that they face. They only see them inside the cage. And a lot of times, and I've said this many times before, that the things that happen outside of the cage can be more brutal than the things that happen inside of the cage. And I thought Kingdom was an excellent show. Quality is always, well, I hope, quality like Kingdom is always going to come to the forefront, and people are going to pay attention because it's just a great show. And then when you combine the element of having mixed martial arts and telling those stories and, the types of things that are fighters and families and all the different things that happen in this crazy world, if you could tell that story extremely well, I think you can bring in so many more fans. I think there were a lot of people that watched that show that maybe weren't even fans of MMA and then became fans of it after. That's tremendous value right there. But Kingdom was just such a great show. So many great actors, the writing, everything. It really was a shame when it went away. I loved being a very small part of it. But, I got a chance to become close friends with John Tucker, one of the main actors in that show. And, got a chance to meet all the other guys from there, Nick Jonas and, Frank Grillo. And they're just so talented. And it inspired me in what I do to push push my levels. But yeah, I really wish they did bring that show back. I get that so much from people who would love to see that show back.
I just think it tells like the true side. I've watched it with friends and try to like get them into it. And I go like, sure, there's a Hollywood effect to it, but a lot of this shit actually happens. Like it's it's so real. You mentioned John Tucker. That is not just a rarity in this sport. His character and all the stuff he went through. But that's neither here or there. When we talk about fighter stories and storytelling, what bigger, no pun intended, story currently kind of going on, not attached to any promotion, and that being Francis Ngannou. He just said, two-faced promoters. One came out and said they won't be submitting a finalized or a final offer. He left the UFC. It's going to be a two-part question because Jon Jones brought up Francis today.
Yeah.
In some crazy news. You're wearing the PFL hat. You don the PFL mic. I mean, is it PFL or bust for Francis at this point?
I'm not sure. I would assume that the UFC is probably still in the running. I don't think that door is closed yet. Dana will tend to say a lot of things. He's a overly emotional guy. But I don't know, maybe his feelings are hurt, or maybe he's so done with Francis that it's not going to happen. But I don't know. I think, if you see value in a fighter, at the end of the day, you have to do what's best for the business. And I think Dana understands that as well. We'll see. But I think that PFL is in the running as well. I think that for Francis, it's kind of bad timing for him in that I think he left at a weird time. It'd be one thing if he left healthy and he was fine. Leaving after a major knee surgery, I think was tough because for a lot of people who are willing to invest in Francis, they're probably thinking, hey, is he going to be the same? He's not a spring chicken. He's not in his mid-20s. Do we invest this money and time in him and then him not be at 100% or not even close, or maybe still compromised, or maybe we only have 6 months with him or a year? I don't know. And then there's the added complexity, the added layer of him wanting to go and pursue boxing as well. So, I appreciate and admire someone like Francis Ngannou who's sticking to his principles and morals and says, this is what I want to do. And you either take it or leave it. The problem is that there's a lot of organizations that are going to go, well, we're going to leave it. So, it's a tough spot. I hope he gets what he deserves. I think it's always best to stick with what you're best at, and which is mixed martial arts. Boxing, can he make a lot of money? Yeah, I'm sure. But it's not like he's going to make peanuts fighting mixed martial arts either. I know there's a lot of numbers being thrown out there for him. And I know he wants to be in the right organization with the right kind of treatment. And I hope he gets that.
Now, the heavyweight champion, the guy who Francis opened the door for basically was Jon Jones. And we waited for his, debut at heavyweight. And he obviously did what he did against Cyril Gane. And now Jon Jones came out, and I think in Australia did an interview and said his fight against Stipe could likely be his last fight. And when asked about Sergey Pavlovich, he said nobody knows him. But Jon said he would be open to fighting Francis if he returned to the UFC. Yeah. Which could be music to Dana's ears, and maybe that softens the emotions a little bit.
Right.
And I know MMA fans could look at it and go, well, didn't Jon just sign a 6-fight deal? I know those contracts don't mean anything when you're certain people. But, my question to you, Kenny, is that it's not like Jon has always been the A side no matter what. And I could, if I wanted to play devil's advocate, Dominic Reyes wasn't at a Francis Ngannou stardom level. Anthony Smith wasn't at a stardom level of Francis Ngannou. So it's not like he's only facing stars at this point in his career. But where do you think this mindset is coming from with Jon Jones?
I've talked about this before on the podcast, and I believe it to be true. I think Jon Jones is motivated by challenges at this stage of the game as well. Not only the money, I think that is a big factor as well, and rightfully so based on everything he's accomplished, but I think that he's motivated by the challenge. He doesn't want to face another guy. He wants to face a guy who he feels is a legitimate threat. Pavlovich is a dangerous guy on the feet as far as striking goes, but I think he's very hittable. I think that, on the ground, Jon Jones would just maul him. I think he'd have a lot of trouble getting on the inside against someone like Jon Jones. Should he land? Yeah, he can knock out anybody, but yeah, I don't see the value in that fight for Jon Jones either. And I think Jon Jones is looking for big names, guys that are going to bring in big money and guys that are going to add to his legacy. And I think that Francis Ngannou is going to add to his legacy. Stipe Miocic is going to add to his legacy. These are gentlemen that people would talk about as some of the best heavyweights in UFC history. And I think that's what he wants. That's what he's chasing. And if he doesn't, then he'll face a name equivalent of, no offense, a Dominic Reyes or a Thiago Santos or a Anthony, why am I blanking?
Lionheart Smith.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Anthony Lionheart Smith, where, okay, these guys are good fighters, but they're not world beaters. And I don't think we saw the best Jon Jones because of it. I don't think that's what gets Jon Jones out of the bed in the morning and gets him to train hard. And I think that's why we saw those lackluster performances, because he's not motivated by facing that. Now, listen, say what you will, say, hey, that's not the job of a champion. A champion should fight anybody. Yeah, there's an argument to that. But I think that you have to adjust things a little bit when you're talking about a guy like Jon Jones, who's been doing this for a very, very long time, and doing it at an extremely high level. So you can only stay at the top for so long. Whatever that recipe is for you that's going to allow you to perform and train at your best, do that. And I think Jon Jones needs, that right antagonistic force. He needs that right recipe and formula for him to train hard and get ready for that fight.
Yeah, I agree. And, in some of our other sports greats, we've seen Tom Brady walk away. LeBron at 38 years old is doing what he's doing. But when you look at a guy like Jon Jones, like, there's nothing more. Like, we've seen it all. You've accomplished it all. Everyone knows he's, like, in my opinion, the greatest fighter of all time. And, and that's solely based off resume. So I completely agree there. I do want to move to UFC 288, mainly just the two big fights, the co-main and the main, which you predicted on the Anik Florian podcast. You guys talked about the co-main between Belal Muhammad, Gilbert Burns. I do think it's a weird time for the champion Leon Edwards. I felt like, Kamaru Usman could kind of just pick who he wanted. And, that's no slight at Kamaru, but I don't know why Colby Covington is next in line. I understand he made weight, and I guess to a point I do understand, but I do think if this weekend's co-main event between Belal and Gilbert is absolute fireworks, as I expect it to be, they should and could leapfrog Colby Covington and be the next title fight. How do you see this fight playing out?
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think that, Leon Edwards has a lot of power in that decision. He can decide in a lot of ways. He doesn't want to fight someone, then he doesn't fight someone. It's like the ball's kind of into his court as well. So yeah, that's interesting. This is going to be a tough one. I think that if we were talking about, different circumstances for Belal Muhammad, I would say, I might change my pick, but I'm leaning towards Gilbert Burns, just because I think that coming off of Ramadan, coming off of not getting a full training camp for a 5-round fight, this isn't a 3-round fight. This is a 5-round fight. And Gilbert Burns has been active. He's been coming off of camp, and he's ready to rock. And I think he's going to be in tremendous shape because of it. He also could be worn down as well, mentally, physically, spiritually, from back-to-back camps. But I don't think that's the case. I think he's still hungry. I think he still wants this. I think Belal's still hungry. And if Belal were to pull this off, I would think it'd be one of the biggest achievements that I've seen just because of the circumstances and the opponent. When I break it down, the other thing that really gets me to lean towards Gilbert Burns is this. When I look at the Bilal fight against Sean Brady was doing very, very good against Bilal Muhammad early on in that fight. Over time, he started to get tired. He started making poor decisions. Bilal came back and got the job done. I don't think Gilbert Burns is a Sean Brady in that I think he's better technically than Sean Brady, but I also think he's way more experienced than Sean Brady. Sean Brady, maybe 3 years from now, 4 years from now, I don't think makes those same mistakes, doesn't pace himself in the same way. I think that Gilbert Burns is a smarter, more experienced version than Sean Brady at this stage of the game. I think he's a more technical version than Sean Brady. I have tremendous respect for Bilal Muhammad, and if he had a proper camp for this fight, I might even go his way for sure. But the circumstances surrounding it, that last fight against Sean Brady, I don't know. Those are the things that kind of sway me the way of Gilbert Burns. And I would love to see Bilal pull it off here, but I think Gilbert Burns has a little bit too much going his way at this stage of the game.
I agree. Talk about the consistency of Gilbert Burns and how active he's been. And, not for nothing, I think Bilal said 44 pounds will be cut, making
That's crazy. That's crazy, man. That's a lot to ask.
How crazy. Yeah, I don't have to tell you how crazy this is. But my other question on that is, what message did they both send to Dana White and the UFC by pretty much demanding it be a 5-round fight? Hey, you guys need your co-main event slot saved. You guys need this pay-per-view saved. The welterweight division has a lot of eyes on it. Leon Edwards has said he doesn't want Colby Covington next. And so you're going to give us a 5-round fight. I think that they pretty much put the ball back in their court by saying 5-round fight, winner will get the next title fight, or we're not saving your pay-per-view.
Yeah. Yeah, that's tricky, man. I don't know what's going to happen with that. Yeah, I don't know.
It's very weird. It's very weird, and it's a little unfortunate because, again, I think we both are in agreement. I think the winner, as long as it is, I would say not a high profile, but as long as it is worthy of a title fight next, whoever gets the finish or the win, if it's a memorable one, I think they should be next. But main event time, and I got to say, obviously for someone who's been in this game for so long, I can't say I'm jealous, but I just love the fact that you have Ray Longo on as often as you do, because I love Ray Longo. Yes. I am going to take John's side on something. I do think you should have told the listeners you were hanging out with, absolute legends recently. I don't know why you wouldn't have, because 5 minutes of me and Matt Serra and the entire world would know it. But that's neither here or there. Yeah. I think Henry Cejudo, his legacy is already set. Yeah. And I think for Aljamain Sterling, it's what more does he have to prove? Because people still do not buy all in on Aljo. And we talked about Jon Jones. Aljamain Sterling, in his own respectful way, is getting close to that point of, he said, listen, Merab's next. I want Henry. I want Sean O'Malley. And then I'm 45. Yeah. And, if he gets through Henry Cejudo, you get no complaints from me on any of that. Right. I think this is not just a fight where Aljo defends his belt, cements his legacy, but Aljo becomes a shot caller in the UFC with a win over Henry. How do you see this fight?
Yeah, man. This is huge for both of those guys. Again, it's the circumstances surrounding this fight, not necessarily the technical aspects of it that make my decision in a certain way. So I'm leaning towards Aljo here. I think that Henry Cejudo is unbelievable. One of the best, forget wrestling, one of the best athletes to ever enter the octagon. I think when you combine that with his intelligence and, of course, his tremendous wrestling pedigree, you have an absolute force. I think that he's heavy-handed. I think if he does get into boxing range against Aljo on more than a few exchanges, he has the possibility of knocking out Aljo and winning by finish. If he does that, man, that would be unreal and gets him closer to legitimately being a GOAT in this sport. But I think that Aljo is going to be able to utilize his kicks to keep it in kicking range and potentially look for an opportunity with Henry Cejudo maybe trying to take him down to transition towards his back. I think that that's where Aljo does his best work. I think he's a legitimate submission threat. I think that if there's one vulnerability perhaps in Henry Cejudo's game, it would be the submission game, I think. Not that we've seen him in trouble and all these crazy submissions, but I think that's where Aljo's going to have a clear advantage. And I think if Aljo can maybe get him up against the fence, maybe he gets a takedown up against the fence just because it's different, a little bit more challenging for wrestlers up against the cage, I think sometimes. And Aljo is very good up against the fence with takedowns and things. But I think it's going to come down to the boxing range of Henry Cejudo and the kicking range of Aljo. And who's able to really impose their will in that range is going to win that fight. So I'm just leaning towards Aljo just because he's been more active, similar to what we talked about in the co-main. He's been way more active. Henry Cejudo hasn't fought for 3 years. If there's one athlete that can come back and still look good, it's Henry Cejudo. But still, it takes a little while to get that timing down. It's one thing to do something in training. It's another thing to do it in competition, to do it in a fight when it matters. And I just feel like there's a lot more hurdles for Henry Cejudo leading up to this one than there is for Aljo.
I think I couldn't agree more. Obviously, expert breakdown, and I didn't ask for predictions. Okay, I don't want to keep you too much longer, but I do want to ask you a few more questions.
Yep.
One thing I obviously step away from the fight game. I'm very intrigued, obviously, because I am someone who is trying to work his ass off to break into this MMA industry. I've been doing it for a few years now. But to have an interest in something outside, as you have BattleBots, what is it about not only how busy you are in the MMA world, but what gets you, keep moving forward with BattleBots, and how are you able to have I don't want to call it a side passion because I don't want to speak for you, but to have something else while focusing on something so chaotic as MMA and MMA broadcasting?
Yeah, well, first and foremost, I think I have a deep love and passion for mixed martial arts and martial arts. I just love it. I love breaking it down. I love learning about it. I love training it when my body allows. So yeah, that's something that I'll always have. And if I have the opportunity to do something that I love, I'm going to do it, especially if I'm going to get paid well to do it. So, and I at the point of my career where I only want to do things that I love to do. And I want to do it to the best of my ability. I don't want to do some half-assed job. So I think you need to have a passion for what you do. And I think that you need some kind of meaning in your life. I think just doing it to do it isn't what we're here for. We're supposed to have something that is going to give meaning to us, something that gets us out of bed, gets us excited. And those things are mixed martial arts for sure. As far as BattleBots goes, I consider that combat in a way, right? I also have learned a tremendous amount from it. The approach, the learning, the engineering, the physics side of things. All of that is related to fighting, and I find it fascinating. I work with great people on BattleBots, and of course, I have a family to support. So, yeah, I just feel lucky with all the opportunities that I've had, and I feel like if you just work your ass off, other opportunities are going to come your way. People are going to take notice, and opportunities will present themselves. So, yeah, I just encourage people to keep, and like yourself, just keep working hard and keep at it. Sometimes it can take 10, 12, 15 years before you break through. And that's just kind of the nature of the beast, unfortunately.
Well, speaking of, obviously I haven't mentioned much of it, but another, one of your jobs is on the PFL, commentary team. We talked a little bit about Francis Ngannou, but what is so different and what stands out the most to you about the PFL? Because obviously when you're calling the action, it's similar, no matter the promotion, you're calling a fight, right? You're calling a mixed martial arts fight, but the PFL with the smart cage and everything else, it's just so unique, so different. And the opportunity, because we talked about storytelling, we talked about all that. There is a story every single time, especially during the regular season, because there's always that grand prize. And I know you've given him credit, and I've come so far because I'm trying to give him credit as well. Jake Paul being involved with the PFL also helps in terms of storytelling because it comes in a financial way as well. What is it that you love the most about being on the PFL broadcast and the PFL as a whole?
I think it's really being a part of something new is something that has always excited me. I was at I don't want to say new at the beginning of the UFC, but it was certainly at a newer point in the sport. I did Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu when it was new in the United States. I did mixed martial arts when it was relatively new. I was a part of the UFC when it was relatively new, just getting onto cable. So I've had an opportunity to be a part of some special things in the earlier stages and the embryonic stages of that. And I think it's always exciting to be a part of something and to help something grow, to play your part and do your role to take things to the next level. When things have already expanded and are already at max capacity, it's easy to be a part of those things. It's much harder to be a part of things when you have competition and you need to break through and you need to get people to pay attention. And being a part of it, I think that's what's most exciting. And of course, learning about a whole different roster of fighters. I think that's always interesting as well. So yeah, being a part of that process is definitely exciting.
Well, everything's come full circle for me today, because I remember when I first journeyed into MMA, I was doing live radio once a week downtown Chicago, and we had a TV in there, and I used to have FS1 on UFC Tonight.
There you
and
go.
I'm like, here we go. And here we are just a few years later, and
Awesome.
You and I are holding this interview, and I can't tell you how much I appreciate. I've got to ask this. Who's been the biggest character? I want to say I know who it is, but who's been the biggest character you've worked with in TV?
Gosh, in TV.
My guess would be Michael Bisping.
Yeah, I mean, that was definitely the first name that came to mind. I'm trying to think of anyone who trumps Michael Bisping.
Because I can't tell you, I got to give you credit as you're thinking, because I've seen so many times, especially when Mike would get into these back and forths with some fighters, and you just held it professional.
Yeah.
No,
I think Michael probably takes the cake on that. I think he is a larger than life personality, both on camera and off camera. He's a trip. I tell you what, Mike, I started off hating him because of what he did to a buddy of mine, Jorge Rivera, when they were kind of going back and forth and, all this stuff. But I don't know if I hated him necessarily, but there was a dislike for Michael Bisping. And when I got a chance to really meet him and hang out with him and work with him, we meshed. I probably meshed with Michael Bisping almost better than anybody I've ever worked with for whatever reason. I don't know why. Maybe it's because I grew up in a family that was very chaotic. There's a lot of chaos and craziness everywhere. But yeah, I vibe with Mike, man. I love the guy. I think he's a great dude, and I miss him very much. I miss the opportunity to work with him, and he would probably take the cake as the biggest character that I've worked with for sure.
Well, I told Jon Anik, and I'll tell you, since I've had everyone of the Anik Florian podcast on this podcast myself now, I need to start rocking some, Anik Flo gear, and I will be doing that. I will definitely be getting my hands on some so I can rock it. I want to personally say thank you, not only for coming on, but your podcast was you and Jon Anik and Cody, and then also Remember the Show and everything that you guys do. It helps a guy like me. I'm not, just 6 months into this. I've been doing this for a few years, and the journey to the top is, and it's not the top. It's just getting that recognition. It's not as easy, but no matter what the view count on my videos are, I know every week I'm firing up, the DraftKings YouTube. I'm watching your shows. I'm watching your breakdowns, and it's giving me that purpose, like we talked about, to get up and do this show. No matter the views, no matter the comments, no matter the notoriety, it's your guys' show and a couple others that get me and keep me going. So I really appreciate that.
Absolutely, man. Thank you so much for the kind words. And Mike, keep at it, man.
I appreciate it. Hopefully this won't be the only time you're on the show, and hopefully we can do it again. But Anik Florian Podcast, catch it on the DraftKings YouTube channel. You can catch Kenny Florian on the PFL and BattleBots broadcast. You can follow him on all social medias, and make sure you follow the Anik Florian Podcast as well. Ken Flo, thank you so much.
Thank you.